Hello, my name is Leslie Corpus, and I will be presenting today on women throughout history. We will be looking at Scotland and its history with women. Let me go ahead and share my screen with everyone. Okay, 1 second. All right, let's go to the presentation now. So for today, we will be looking into the suffrage movement, and we will also learn about the Edinburgh Seven, a couple of notable figures such as Flora MacDonald and Mary Queen of Scots, among others, and women within their clans. We will also learn about the reproductive rights of women over the years and the education they were and were not allowed to receive. Looking into the suffrage movement and Scotland's role with it, we will go ahead and make clear what a suffragette is and what a suffragist is. So a suffragist is a woman actively involved in the suffrage movement for getting votes for women in Scotland and all over the world, actually. While a suffragette was as well someone involved in the suffrage movement for bettering the rights of women, but the difference would be that a suffragette was more involved in the militant aspect and role of the movement. Acts such as burning down buildings, for example, and doing some damage to private property or public property. However, it is very important to note that even throughout the height of the suffragette militant act in Scotland, the women were very careful to never actually harm anybody, never physically harm anyone during their militant acts. A big misbelief is that the movement is thought to center in London, but Scotland did play a major role in it as well. Let's look at Edinburgh. It held one of the earliest suffrage societies from the 1870s. A bit of the militancy episode in the movement, in the suffrage movement, occurred after women were being continually denied votes in major elections. That is what led to the launching of Scotland's militant episode. Despite the women originally taking on a requesting approach, they went on to take a demanding approach. What I mean by this is that their initial methods for requesting their rights to vote included doing petitions, writing letters, and pestering the parliament members, but never harassing them, not really. And then from those more innocent acts that came the militant episode of the suffrage movement in Scotland, where women in 1903 took a turn towards these acts. For example, the Pankhurst within the Women's Social and Political Union, the WSPU. The Pankhurst were included women that were named Emmeline and her daughters Christabel, Sylvia, and Adela within the Women's Social and Political Union. They were a group of women who committed militant acts and would they started to shift the union, the Women's Social and Political Union. They started to shift it towards militancy instead of their initial methods, like I said, petitions and writing letters. Their militant acts included burning buildings, grandstands at racecourses, pouring acid into post boxes to destroy mail to keep it from getting to the destinations. Again, never in here do they physically harm anybody else. The Pankhurst heavy-handed leadership led to many suffrage supporters leaving the WSPU, Women's Social and Political Union, and forming the WFL. We're going to look at also the Cat and Mouse Act of 1913. Within this act stated that women who were being taken who were being imprisoned due to their militant acts and destroying property in Scotland, yes, they were being imprisoned, but thanks to the act and their hunger strikes, which many of them committed, after seeing that from hunger strikes they were left weak and malnourished, under the Cat and Mouse Act of 1913, the women were they had to be liberated because they were seen as could no longer continue to complete their imprisonment period. And under this act, Mrs. Pankhurst, after just being released from prison under the act, was sneaked into the 1914 St. Andrew Hall riot in Glasgow to give a speech. She was then arrested again since police reasoned that if she was well enough to that if she was well enough to participate and give a speech of her own, then she could very well return back to prison. In 1900, women gained the right to vote in local elections and in school boards, but it did not stretch beyond that. So there was a small advancement in the suffrage movement, but again, very limited. And in 1918, suffrage rights granted to Scottish women included results such as the Representation in the People Act, where women over 30 can now vote. And with the Sex Disqualification Act, it became illegal to stop women from working in public roles for sex or marriage reasons. In 1923, the Duchess of Atholl became the first female MP in Scotland. And in 1969, the voting age is lowered to 18 for everyone. Then we look at 2016, very recently, well, not so recently anymore, the voting age again lowered to 16 years old this time. We will now see about the Edinburgh Seven, who were a group of university students that were all studying medicine at the Edinburgh University in the 1800s. They were the first women to complete their undergrad studies at any British university, which was in itself a grand feat for them. They did complete their undergrad studies. However, they were prevented from graduating when male students blocked their path to an anatomy classroom on the day of their finals exams. So imagine that you are studying your butt off day after day, and in an environment in which you are one of the very few of your kind, of your female kind, to be able to do this, to have this privilege afforded for you, and only to have your path blocked the day of a very important exam and being unable to graduate. That is heart-wrenching. So then they then went on to spearhead campaigns towards granting other women the rights they themselves were denied. And in 1877, legislation passed that allowed women those rights in the UK and Ireland. The women involved were Sophia Jacques-Blake, Isabel Thorne, Edith Peachey, Matilda Chaplin, Helen Evans, Mary Anderson, and Emily Bovell. Now looking at a couple of important figures throughout history. One of them is Elsie Inglis, who was a doctor and a suffragist. She is very important because her work was fundamental. She ran and funded Scottish women's hospitals for foreign service during the First World War. She was not allowed, because of her age, she was over 50 years old at the time. And because of her age, she was, and also I'm pretty sure that it did not help that she was a female and not a male. Because of her age, she was told that she could not be actively involved in the war as she wanted to be. She wanted to go into the war and help in the way that she could, being a doctor. So after being rejected from there, she ran and funded the Scottish Women's Hospitals for Foreign Service, established 14 hospital units across Europe, and she was the first woman awarded the Order of the White Eagle. Next, we have Flora Drummond, a suffragette. She joined the WSPU, Women's Social and Political Union, in 1905 as a full-time organizer, arrested in 1906 for repeatedly knocking the Prime Minister's door, who did not press charges. She was, though, arrested again and served her first imprisonment term months later. Another very important figure throughout history is Flora MacDonald, who, if you ask any Scot, she is very well known. I am so sorry for this. No. Nope. You guys can have toys right here. I don't want you bothering me. I apologize for the interruption. Now we're looking at Flora MacDonald, who, if you ask any Scot in the UK, can probably tell you who she is. She is the woman who helped the Bonnie Prince Charlie escape Scotland after the battle of the famous Battle of Culloden in 1746, which happened during the last Jacobite rebellion. It is just a brief description. The Battle of Culloden is what marked the downfall of the Highlander way of life in 1746. And in her honor is a Skyboat song, which I will link for you all down below. For whenever you have a chance, go ahead and listen to it because it is very nice. Personally, I like the Outlander version of the song because I am very into that series, very educational. And lastly, looking at Mary Queen of Scots, she had a tremendous, well-shaped education, seeing as she was one of the very few female monarchs throughout Scottish history. And hers was a story of tragedy and romance, and they even made another show about her as well called Reign, which also I recommend. And yes, her story is one of great feats throughout history. Now, women within their clans and marriage. There was a tradition that was very common in the Highlands. It was essentially a trial marriage that lasted for a year and a day called hand fasting. So a couple who was looking to be engaged, they would get engaged, and if often at the times when Highlands were the style of life in Scotland, there were not priests available very easily. So instead of waiting long months or even years for a priest to come around or be contacted and have him give out the ceremony and declare them husband and wife, the Scots in the Highlands would engage in hand fasting, and in which sexual activity could be often accepted as legitimate. Also, arranged marriages. They were very common and usually arranged by the clan chiefs within the same clan members for the sake of clan strength. So you would often see that, again, a clan is not a literal blood relation, blood linked family members. They are seen as one big family, but they are in actuality many different blood relations. They do not often share a common ancestor. It is mostly symbolic, the fact that they say that they share a common ancestor. So they would often marry people within the same clan for emphasizing clan strength and making them more powerful. There was, however, also marriage between clans where women would keep their own surnames since they were essentially not joining their husband's clan. They were rather forging a friendship between her clan and her husband's. Women at the time could marry at 12 and boys at 14. The mothers were often the matchmakers in these arranged marriages or in the seeking of a marriage alliance, as they were often political. Divorce was allowed under grounds of adultery and abandonment as well, which again was it would be very difficult to prove that your husband was being adulterous to you, and only in times when they would write out abandon the wives or the wives abandon the husbands was divorce allowed. For reproductive rights, we're looking at the 1967 Abortion Act, in which a legislation passed stating grounds by which medical professionals were allowed to perform pregnancy terminations. Now, the grounds for abortion at this time that were involved in the act stated that really an abortion was only allowed to be carried out if the risk of staying pregnant and giving birth to the baby was could be proved to be greater than the abortion risk, and also if there was a high risk of severe handicap to the baby. Only then were there grounds for abortion. This legislation encompassed Scotland, England, and Wales as well. Now, the Great Divide. This act was medicalized by the state. Since they were the ones that passed this legislation, the state essentially said that under those grounds, abortion was allowed. It would be legal. However, there were plenty of medical professionals that were opposed to the procedures. So even though the state now deemed it acceptable under the previously mentioned circumstances, the medical professionals that were the only ones allowed by law to practice abortion would not do it. Very often they simply would not do it. They had never received previous special training on the matter, and they were therefore unprepared to deal with the change. Lastly, education for women. You have in the 15th century, sewing schools in Edinburgh were likely taught by nuns. And by the time of the mid 17th century, you had boarding schools that were often headed by women for girls of noble households, households that could afford to help fund the boarding schools, which did allow for a better education for girls than in the 15th century sewing schools. There were, however, complaints by the 18th century of traders, merchants, and craftsmen's daughters, the lower class daughters, joining those boarding schools. And it was something that the higher class households that were sending their own daughters, their own highborn daughters to the schools for, did not agree with. They didn't want their schools, the schools that the daughters would attend, to be tainted by the lower class daughters. Therefore, dame schools were set up by widows or spinsters for the poorer girls, in which they would teach reading, sewing, and cooking skills alike. But with the Education Act of 1945, it focused on growth of secondary education, which was mostly for girls and mostly served them, since girls at the time were still the ones that were a little bit more behind. So things had already started to change for girls education wise, but they still needed that leg up, and that is what the Education Act of 1945 helped them with. And in the 1980s, there was able to be less gender differences as girls' attainment caught up with that of boys. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation. That concludes it today. Thank you.